The law comes as a whisper from a god, spoken through the mouth of a king 4,000 years ago. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. You stand before the source of that whisper now, in the cool, quiet halls of the Louvre. Before you rises a pillar of black diorite, 2 meters tall, polished by millennia until it drinks the gallery light. It is the Code of Hammurabi. Your eyes follow the dense web of cuneiform script, wedge-shaped marks pressed into stone with absolute authority. These are not suggestions, not moral guidelines. They are the gears of civilization, a legal machine governing millions. And hidden within these intricate carvings is a codified brutality that shaped the very meaning of love, property, and betrayal for centuries. This is where our story begins, a story written not in ink but in stone and in blood. Before we descend deeper into this world, take a moment. Wherever you're listening tonight, London, Los Angeles, a quiet room in Lagos, welcome to Sapiens Untold. Settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you can. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. We are a community of curious minds, gathered here to explore the forgotten chapters of our shared human story. If mysteries like this pull at you the way they pull at me, consider hitting like and subscribing. It tells us we're on the right path. Now, let us return to that black stone, to the unblinking judgment of the lawgiver king, Hammurabi. Let's trace the lines that decided who lived and who was thrown, bound and helpless, into the river. Your fingers hover over the stone, tracing the air above the deep, precise grooves. You find the section, about halfway down the pillar, that details the laws of family. Law 129. Hammurabi's hand guided the chisel that carved this fate. You can almost feel the cold finality of the words as they were hammered into permanence. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. It is simple, symmetrical, brutal. There is no trial by jury, no appeal. The river is the executioner. The law gives them one desperate hope. If the husband, in an act of mercy, spares his wife, then the king must also pardon her lover. The power of life and death rests entirely in the hands of the wronged man. To understand this severity, you must recalibrate your modern sense of justice. For the Babylonians, adultery was not primarily a crime of passion or a moral failing. It was a crime of property. Under Mesopotamian law, a married woman was, in a legal sense, the possession of her husband. Her fidelity was not a matter of the heart. It was a matter of ensuring the integrity of his bloodline. In an agricultural society built on the inheritance of land and livestock from father to son, a wife's infidelity was a catastrophic threat. It rendered paternity uncertain, dissolving the very foundation of social order and wealth transfer. A man could legally visit prostitutes or take secondary wives and concubines without consequence. His sexuality was his own. His wife's sexuality, however, was a controlled asset, essential to the state's stability. Behind every carved line of Law 129 lies this cold, pragmatic logic. The woman's body was the vessel of her husband's legacy. Any other man who trespassed there was not just a lover. He was a thief, stealing the certainty of the future. You leave the polished stone of Babylon behind. The heat on the Iraqi plain is a physical weight, pressing down on the ruins of a city even older, a place of baked brick and dust. You stand where the walls of Uruk once rose, a city that saw Gilgamesh walk its streets. The air is thick with the silence of 5,000 years. Here the law wasn't always carved in monumental diorite for kings to admire. It was pressed into palm-sized tablets of wet clay, the day-to-day legal machinery for ordinary people. It is in these later texts from the city-states of Assyria that the law's cruelty finds a new, more intimate expression. 7 centuries after Hammurabi, the Middle Assyrian laws gave the wronged husband a terrible menu of choices. He was no longer required to turn his wife over to the river. The power was now entirely his. The clay tablets are explicit. If his wife was caught in adultery, he could kill her, he could pardon her, or he could choose a third path, a punishment designed not just to end a life but to shatter it. He could mutilate her. The law specifies cutting off her nose or her ears. The blade in the husband's hand was not merely an instrument of pain, it was a tool of permanent social branding. The woman would live, but her face would forever carry the public record of her crime. She became a walking testament to her husband's authority and her own shame, a deterrent more potent than a quiet death by drowning. And in a moment of brutal symmetry, the law prescribed that her lover suffer the exact same fate. If the husband chose the knife for his wife, he was legally entitled to take the man's nose as well. The choice was a crucible of honour and rage, mercy, death, or a life of visible disgrace. You hold a replica of an Assyrian clay tablet in your hand. It's surprisingly heavy, cool to the touch. The cuneiform script is a dense lattice of impressions. It's easy to see these as sterile legal documents, but reading between the lines reveals a sophisticated, if harsh, legal mind at work. These laws were not merely instruments of patriarchal rage. They contained surprising nuances, flickers of protection for women in a world designed to control them. Consider this. If a man raped a married woman, she was considered entirely blameless. The law stated there is no punishment for the wife. Only the rapist was to be put to death. The code made a clear distinction between coercion and consent. Look closer at the tablet. Another law protects a wife from slander. If a husband publicly accused his wife of adultery but could produce no witnesses to the act, he himself faced punishment, a public flogging, and a heavy fine. The law recognized the devastating power of a false accusation and sought to curb it. There were even provisions for the casualties of war. If a woman's husband was captured in battle, and, having no means to support herself, she remarried, she was not held liable if her first husband eventually returned. The law acknowledged her impossible choice, remarry or starve, and offered her a legal shield. These exceptions are crucial. They prove that Mesopotamian legal systems, for all their brutality, were not barbaric. They were complex, attempting to legislate intent, accident, and circumstance. But this very sophistication highlights the central tragedy. For a woman to be protected, she had to prove she was a victim. Her innocence was predicated on her lack of agency, her passivity in the face of violation or desperate circumstance. Proving rape was nearly impossible, placing a terrifying burden of proof on the woman. These small protections were islands of justice in a vast sea of patriarchal control. You stand on the banks of the Euphrates as the sun bleeds across the horizon, turning the slow-moving water to liquid bronze. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and river reeds. This river was not just a source of life for Mesopotamia, it was an arbiter of divine justice. The punishment prescribed by Hammurabi's code was a public spectacle, a ritual played out on these very banks. You can almost see them, a man and a woman, bound together with coarse rope, their pleas lost in the murmur of the gathered crowd. They are pushed from the bank into the current. There is no struggle, only the sudden shock of cold water and the desperate, futile fight for air. This was trial by ordeal. The river god, it was believed, would render the final verdict. Drowning was a sign of guilt, but if by some miracle they managed to break their bonds and survive the ordeal, they were declared innocent by divine intervention. The archaeological record is silent on how many survived, but survival was not the primary purpose of the punishment. The spectacle was. In a society built on a fragile network of honour and shame, public punishment was a powerful tool. The drowning of an adulterous couple wasn't just retribution, it was a violent public restoration of order. It demonstrated the wronged husband's power, cleansed the stain on his family's honour, and served as a chilling warning to anyone else who might contemplate a similar transgression. The river remembers these stories. The silt at its bottom is a quiet archive of shattered lives, a testament to a time when the price of desire was a desperate, gasping death in the current's embrace. Behind every law there is a human cost. You move from the riverbank to the sterile quiet of an archaeological collections vault. The air is dry, controlled, smelling faintly of old earth and preservation chemicals. You're here because drowning and mutilation were not the only fates prescribed. Before you, laid out on a velvet tray, are bone fragments excavated from a site near the ancient city of Mari. They are brittle, ochre-coloured, their stories whispered in fractures and abrasions. While Mesopotamian texts are clear on the law, the archaeological evidence for specific execution methods is hauntingly scarce. Flesh and rope dissolve, but other methods, whispered in more obscure texts, would have left indelible marks. Some legal tablets mention impalement for the most egregious sexual transgressions. Imagine a sharpened wooden stake driven into the ground outside the city walls, a woman, convicted of adultery, forced onto it, a slow, agonizing death lasting hours, perhaps days, her body left as a public warning. The thought is horrific, yet the logic is consistent with the culture's need for powerful deterrence. Other punishments were reserved for specific classes. If a temple priestess, considered married to a god, committed a sexual sin or was even seen entering a tavern, some texts suggest she could be burned alive. Her crime was not just adultery, but sacrilege, a betrayal of the divine, and while less documented in Mesopotamia than in later cultures, communal stoning likely occurred in certain contexts, transforming the punishment from a husband's private right to a collective, brutal act of social purification. The bones before you are anonymous, their cause of death lost to time, but they are a physical reminder. Behind every abstract law there was a body that suffered, a life that ended in agony, fulfilling a covenant of honor written in blood. You're in the hushed archives of a university library now, the air filled with the papery scent of old books. You're looking at translations of economic and social tablets from ancient Sumeria, documents that detail marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, and business deals. It's here, in the mundane accounting of daily life, that the social logic behind the brutal punishments becomes clear. Mesopotamian society was built on a rigid honor-shame dynamic. A family's reputation was its most valuable asset, determining everything from creditworthiness in the market to the marriage prospects of its children. A daughter from a disgraced house was unmarriageable. A son could not secure an advantageous alliance. Adultery wasn't a private failing, it was a public act of sabotage against one's own kin. The violent public punishment of an adulterous wife was a desperate act of social repair. It was a declaration by the husband that he would not tolerate this stain upon his house. By mutilating or killing his wife, he was signalling to the community his willingness to enforce social norms, no matter the personal cost. The spectacle restored his masculine authority and, in a brutal way, cauterized the wound to his family's honor. To our modern sensibilities, this is monstrous. To them, it was the necessary surgery to save the social body. Without paternity certainty, inheritance collapses. Without honor, the family unit dissolves. From their perspective, our modern sexual freedoms would not look like liberty. They would look like a direct invitation to civilizational collapse. Understanding this doesn't excuse the brutality, it explains it. It reveals a worldview where the survival of the collective was so paramount that the life and body of an individual woman were considered an acceptable price to pay for it. The historical context is an explanation, not an exoneration. The law did not apply equally to all. In the stratified world of Mesopotamia, justice was a reflection of social hierarchy. You trace the cuneiform for the word awilum, nobleman, then mushkenum, commoner, then wardum, slave. Hammurabi's code makes careful, deliberate distinctions between them. If the wife of a nobleman committed adultery with a commoner, the punishments were amplified, the crime compounded by its violation of the social order. The transgression was not merely sexual, it was an affront to the rigid class structure that held their world together. Conversely, if a slave woman was caught in adultery, the consequences were vastly different. Her crime was not against honor, but against her master's property. Often the punishment was not death or mutilation, but financial compensation paid to her owner. Her body, her fidelity, was an asset with a calculable monetary value. This careful gradation reveals something profound. These were not the laws of a primitive or barbaric people. They were the product of a deeply ordered, complex, and systematic legal mind. They accounted for status, property rights, and social stability with a terrifying precision. And so, behind every law that demanded death for a nobleman's wife, there was another that prescribed a simple fine for a slave. It's a chilling calculus, where the value of a woman's life and the severity of her punishment were dictated not by the act itself, but by the status of the man who owned her. The law was not blind. It saw class, it saw status, and it saw property. And in the silent, anonymous archives of the earth, in the scattered fragments of lives lived and lost, you're left with the ghost of that brutal order. An entire civilization built on a foundation where a woman's worth was measured by her husband's rank, and her virtue was, ultimately, his possession. You're in the cool, silent dark of a tomb, deep beneath the Theban hills of Egypt. The oppressive desert heat vanishes, replaced by a profound stillness that tastes of dust and eternity. The light glides across a painted wall, the mineral pigments, lapis blue, malachite green, red ochre, shockingly alive after 3,000 years. Before you is the final judgment. The jackal-headed god Anubis leads a soul to a great golden scale. On one side, the heart of the deceased, on the other, a single, weightless ostrich feather. This is the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, harmony, and cosmic order. This is the Egyptian conception of justice, not merely a king's decree to protect property, but a universal law that governed gods and mortals alike. Here, in the land of the Nile, adultery was also a capital crime, but its logic was fundamentally different. It was not a violation of ownership. It was an act of isfet, of chaos, a lie that disrupted the universal balance represented by Maat. The punishments were designed not to restore a husband's honor, but to purify the world of this disruption. Ancient texts, like the tale from the Westcar Papyrus, describe the fate of an adulterous wife. When her transgression is discovered, she is executed by burning, a sentence of total annihilation. Her lover faces a different, though equally final fate. He is given to the crocodiles in the Nile. The brutality is familiar, but the philosophy is a world away. These punishments were not a husband's personal vengeance. They were a ritualistic cleansing. The agents of chaos were fed to the sacred forces of fire and water, restoring the cosmic balance they had disturbed. Their sin was not just against a person, it was against the stability of the universe itself, an imbalance that had to be righted before the soul could even face this final painted trial on the wall before you. You unroll a facsimile of a papyrus scroll. It is a copy of what is known as Spell 125 from the Book of the Dead. The original delicate fibres of the papyrus plant are now protected under glass in a museum, but here you can trace the fine lines of the hieroglyphic script. This is the negative confession, a list of 42 sins the deceased must deny before the gods to prove their worthiness for the afterlife. It is a moral inventory of an entire civilization. The deceased would declare, "I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied." And among these declarations is another crucially important one: "I have not committed adultery." This places the sin in a completely different context from Mesopotamia. In Egypt, adultery was not a matter for a human court, but for the divine tribunal. The punishment was not meted out by a husband, but by the gods in the afterlife. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of Maat, and if it was heavy with the sin of adultery, it would be fed to the monstrous crocodile-headed demon, Amit, the devourer of the dead. This was a second, final death, an obliteration of the soul, yet this cosmic judgment was reserved for the man. The woman, while she could be divorced and shamed for her actions, was not considered the primary sinner. It was the man's act of polluting another man's marriage bed that disturbed the cosmic order. This represents a subtle but profound shift. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where the woman's body was property, in Egypt it was the man's action that was the focus of divine condemnation. The woman suffered social consequences, but the man suffered eternal ones. The laws of Mesopotamia protected property. The laws of Egypt, at least in this regard, sought to protect the universe itself. The laboratory is silent, save for the low hum of an electron microscope. You lean forward, your eyes fixed on the monitor. On the screen, magnified thousands of times, is the surface of a cuneiform tablet. The landscape is alien, a topography of microscopic canyons and ridges pressed into clay by a reed stylus 4 millennia ago. This is where the grand narratives of law and religion meet the quiet, desperate reality of individual lives. The archaeological record is mostly silent on the names of the women who faced these brutal punishments. But in the cracks, in the spaces between the official histories, fragments of their stories survive. You're examining a divorce petition from the city of Sippar dated to the reign of Hammurabi. A woman, whose name is lost to a fracture in the clay, is pleading for a divorce on the grounds of her husband's cruelty. Her plea is not a demand for freedom, but a desperate negotiation for survival. Another tablet, a personal letter, contains a cryptic reference to a woman of the river, a chillingly casual euphemism for someone who has faced the ordeal prescribed in Law 129. These are not grand pronouncements from a king's stele. They are the whispers of ordinary people, caught in the gears of an unforgiving legal machine. They are stories of women in loveless arranged marriages, of women falsely accused by jealous husbands, of women trapped between desire and a law that promised an agonizing death for a single misstep. Each execution was the end of a story. Someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who sought love, or was merely accused of seeking it, whose name is now lost to the dust. The microscope reveals the ghost of the scribe's hand, but the woman's voice remains an echo, a silence that speaks volumes about the human cost of order. You leave the microscope and step back, the vast sweep of history settling around you. From the black diorite stele of Hammurabi to the fragile clay tablets of Assyria, a single, unwavering principle emerges. These laws, in all their calculated brutality, were not fundamentally about love, or even morality as we understand it. They were about order. They were the legal architecture designed to support a civilization built on agriculture, inheritance, and patriarchy. The absolute control of a woman's sexuality was the load-bearing pillar in that structure. Her body was the guarantor of a man's lineage, the vessel through which property and status flowed from one generation to the next. Any threat to that certainty, any whisper of adultery, was not a personal betrayal, but an existential threat to the entire system. Drowning, mutilation, impalement. These were not acts of chaotic violence. They were instruments of social engineering, designed to terrorize women into compliance and demonstrate a husband's absolute authority. For thousands of years, across the Fertile Crescent and beyond, these codes were enforced, shaping the lives and deaths of countless unnamed women. We can analyze the legal logic, understand the social pressures, and even acknowledge the genuine anxieties about succession and stability that drove these laws. But to explain is not to excuse. These systems, for all their sophistication, were built on a foundation of profound gender inequality, a world where one half of humanity was legally rendered the property of the other. The silence in the archaeological record speaks to their terrifying success. The women who obeyed, who lived in fear and complied, left no trace. It is only the accused, the punished, the women of the river, whose ghosts still haunt the edges of the historical record, reminding us that the price of civilization is sometimes paid in unimaginable human suffering. You travel east, leaving Mesopotamia and Egypt behind. The air grows thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of monsoon rains on parched earth. You stand among the silent geometric ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, a city of the Indus Valley civilization. The baked brick walls rise around you, remnants of a society that flourished contemporaneously with Sumeria and Old Kingdom Egypt. But here, the familiar markers of ancient power are absent. There are no grand temples to warrior gods, no lavish tombs celebrating despotic kings, no monumental steles proclaiming brutal laws. There is only a profound, unsettling quiet. The Indus Valley script remains undeciphered, a constellation of elegant symbols whose meaning is lost to us. Without their words, we are left with only their artifacts and their architecture. And what they left behind tells a different story. You see it in the meticulously planned streets, the advanced public sanitation systems with covered drains, the standardized weights and measures found across a vast territory, stretching for hundreds of miles. This was a civilization obsessed not with conquest and glory, but with precision, trade, and civic order. The archaeological record here has yielded no clear evidence of armies, battles, or the glorification of violence, and in this silence, a question forms. In a society so different from Mesopotamia, how did they conceive of justice? How did they handle transgressions like adultery? Did they share the same anxieties about paternity and inheritance, or did their unique social structure lead to a different legal philosophy? The absence of a deciphered legal code is an abyss of unknowing, but perhaps the silence itself is the answer. Perhaps a society that did not build monuments to kings and wars also did not need to carve laws of brutal retribution into stone. Perhaps their concept of order was maintained not through fear and violence, but through a social contract we can no longer read, an echo of a different way of being that now only whispers from the dust. You're holding a small, intricately carved steatite seal, no bigger than your thumb. It feels cool and smooth, worn by the passage of 4,500 years. On its face is the image of a bull, powerful and serene, with a line of elegant, undeciphered script above it. Thousands of these seals have been unearthed across the Indus Valley, each a masterpiece of miniature art. They are believed to have been used to mark ownership of goods, a testament to a bustling merchant culture. But it is the imagery on these seals that deepens the mystery of their society. Alongside the bulls and unicorns, you find recurring depictions of what appear to be powerful female figures, often associated with tigers or trees. Some scholars interpret these as mother goddesses, central deities in a belief system that may have venerated feminine power. Consider the implications. A society that places female deities at the center of its cosmology might have a very different view of women's roles, sexuality, and legal standing. While Mesopotamia worshipped powerful goddesses like Inanna, their earthly counterparts were treated as property. Here, the sheer prevalence of these female figures suggests a different dynamic. Does this point to a more egalitarian society, perhaps one where lineage was traced through the mother, making a wife's fidelity a less explosive issue? Without written laws, we are left to speculate, to read the silent language of their art. But the contrast is stark. The grand narrative of Mesopotamian law is written in the language of patriarchal control and brutal punishment. The narrative of the Indus Valley is written in these small, intimate objects, depicting a world of commerce, craftsmanship, and a reverence for the feminine that has no parallel in the river valleys to the west. The riddle of the seals is the riddle of their civilization, a society that achieved immense sophistication without the scaffolding of kings, armies, or perhaps the terrible calculus of laws that priced a woman's life based on her fidelity. You stand on a ziggurat under a night sky so clear it feels like a dome of polished obsidian. The air is cool and thin. Below you, the spectral outlines of Babylon's ruins are bathed in moonlight. Up here, priest astronomers charted the heavens with a mathematical precision that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. They tracked the movements of Venus, predicted eclipses, and created the zodiac. To them, the cosmos was not a random scattering of lights. It was a divine text, a celestial cuneiform tablet where the will of the gods was written. And just as the stars moved in predictable, orderly paths, so too must human society. The laws of Hammurabi were not just a human invention, they were seen as an earthly reflection of this divine cosmic order. A wife's fidelity was a terrestrial planet, expected to hold to its proper orbit. Her deviation was a cosmic disturbance, a misalignment that threatened the harmony between the heavens and the earth. In their worldview, an act of adultery was like a rogue star, disrupting the celestial mechanics of family, inheritance, and honor. The brutal punishments were a form of gravitational correction, a violent realignment of a social fabric they believed was woven from the same threads as the constellations. This is the key to understanding their mindset. The law was not merely a tool of social control. It was a sacred duty, an act of maintaining the fragile order of civilization in a universe governed by divine principles. From this vantage point, looking up at the same stars they charted, you can almost feel the weight of that belief system, the profound conviction that a single act of private passion could unravel the very fabric of the cosmos. Their laws were brutal, yes, but to them they were as necessary as the rising of the sun. You hold a clay tablet known as the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa. It is a dry academic astronomical text, a record of the risings and settings of the planet Venus over a 21-year period during the reign of a Babylonian king. But this document is more than just a star chart. It is an artifact of a mindset that saw no separation between the movements of the heavens and the affairs of humanity. For the Babylonians, Venus was the celestial manifestation of the goddess Ishtar, known to the Sumerians as Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She was a deity of terrifying dualities, a bringer of both passion and destruction. Her path across the sky was a divine omen, dictating the fates of kings and commoners alike. When Ishtar appeared bright and stable in the heavens, it augured prosperity and order on earth. But if her movements were erratic, if she vanished from the sky for too long, it was a sign of chaos, a warning that the divine harmony was fractured. In this worldview, a woman's adultery was an earthly manifestation of Ishtar's chaotic aspect. It was a sin against the goddess herself, an act that mirrored her most destructive and unpredictable qualities. The brutal legal punishments, then, can be seen as a desperate ritual to appease a volatile deity. By sacrificing the woman who embodied this chaos, the community sought to restore stability, to bring their small world back into alignment with the predictable, orderly heavens. The husband was not just reclaiming his property, he was acting as a priest, performing a human sacrifice to restore balance to a cosmos where the goddess of love was also the goddess of war, and where the movements of a distant planet could decree a sentence of death. The judgment was not just the king's, it was written in the sky. You're now in the halls of the British Museum, before the clay tablets that hold the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving work of literature. Your eyes scan the Akkadian cuneiform, the story of a king who wrestled with gods and searched for the secret of immortality. But hidden within this epic of heroism and loss is a clue to a different, older understanding of sexuality and order. The story tells of the sacred marriage rite, or hierosgamos. In this crucial ritual, the king of the city would symbolically marry a high priestess of Inanna. Their union was not a personal one, it was a cosmic event, a sacred performance designed to ensure the fertility of the land, the abundance of crops, and the prosperity of the entire civilization. This ritual places marriage and sexuality in a completely different light. It suggests a worldview where controlled, sacred sexuality was the engine of civilization. The king and priestess were not just people, they were conduits for divine power. Their union renewed the covenant between humanity and the gods. In this context, the adultery of a common woman takes on a darker, more dangerous meaning. It is not just a violation of property, it is a profane parody of the sacred marriage. It is a chaotic, unsanctioned act of creation that threatens to usurp the sacred power reserved for the king and the temple. It is a ritual inversion, a private act that mimics and therefore pollutes the most important public rite. The brutal punishment of the adulterous woman, then, can be seen as an attempt to purge this profanity, to erase the profane copy and restore the sanctity of the original. The law was not just protecting a husband's lineage, it was protecting the sacred integrity of the entire cosmological order, an order that began with the sacred union of a king and a priestess in a temple chamber. You're looking at a translation of the Sumerian king list, a remarkable document that blends myth and history into a single, seamless narrative. It lists the kings of Sumer, both before and after a great mythical flood, noting the lengths of their impossibly long reigns. The document begins with a powerful statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is the foundational political theory of Mesopotamia. The right to rule is not won by conquest alone, but is a gift bestowed by the gods. The king is not just a warlord, he is a shepherd, divinely appointed to maintain order and prosperity on earth. This concept of divine right is the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The king's authority is absolute because it is celestial, and the laws he enacts, like those of Hammurabi, are therefore not just human edicts but expressions of divine will. This elevates the entire legal system to a sacred plane. A transgression against the law is a transgression against the gods. When a woman commits adultery, she is not just violating her husband's property rights or staining his honor, she is challenging the divinely ordained structure of the society that the king is charged to protect. Her act is one of rebellion against the cosmic order that flows down from heaven to the king, and from the king to every household in the land. The brutality of the punishment reflects the magnitude of the crime. It is the king, as the earthly agent of the gods, reasserting divine order in the face of human chaos. The woman's body becomes the canvas upon which this terrifying lesson is painted, a lesson that affirms the king's sacred power and the unshakable hierarchy that begins in the heavens and ends in the suffocating grip of the law. You zoom out, pulling away from the specifics of any single culture. Your perspective shifts from ground level to a satellite's view. Suddenly, the trial by water in Hammurabi's code no longer looks like an isolated Mesopotamian custom. It appears as part of a strange global pattern. You are now in medieval Europe, watching a woman accused of witchcraft being bound and thrown into a river. If she sinks and drowns, she's declared innocent, her soul now with God. If she floats, she's deemed a witch, pulled from the water and burned at the stake. The logic is inverted, but the mechanism is the same. The water is the arbiter of divine judgment. You shift your gaze to ancient India, where the laws of Manu describe a similar trial by water for a man accused of theft. To Africa, where certain tribes would administer a poison to an accused person. Survival proved innocence, death proved guilt. To Southeast Asia, where accused parties might be forced to retrieve a stone from a pot of boiling oil, their unblemished skin a sign from the gods. This practice, the trial by ordeal, is a bizarre and persistent fingerprint of the human legal imagination, appearing in disconnected cultures across thousands of years and vast geographical distances. It speaks to a deeply ingrained human impulse. When our own systems of evidence and judgment fail, when we are faced with a crime that is secret and unwitnessed, like adultery, we outsource the verdict to a higher power. We ask the river, the fire, the poison to speak for the gods. The Euphrates of Hammurabi's time was not unique. It was simply one of the earliest recorded instances of a legal tradition that would haunt humanity for millennia, a desperate appeal to the supernatural for a certainty that the human world could not provide. Your journey ends where it began, back in the quiet gallery of the Louvre, standing before the black diorite pillar of Hammurabi. The stone is cool and impassive, its cuneiform script a silent testament to an order that endured for millennia. You have travelled from the banks of the Euphrates to the tombs of Egypt, from the ruins of the Indus Valley to the celestial maps of Babylon. You have seen how the same human fear, the fear of social chaos, of uncertain lineage, of divine anger, can manifest in profoundly different legal and cosmological systems. For the Mesopotamians, it was a fear of property loss and dishonour, a practical anxiety about the mechanics of an agricultural society. For the Egyptians, a fear of cosmic imbalance, a spiritual crisis that threatened the soul's journey into eternity. For the people of the Indus Valley, perhaps no fear at all, or a fear so alien to us that we cannot even recognize its shape in their silent artifacts. The Code of Hammurabi is not an anomaly. It is one of the earliest and most complete expressions of a legal framework that would echo through history, a framework that sought to control the female body as a means of controlling the future. Its brutality was not random. It was a carefully calibrated instrument of power, designed to maintain a specific social, economic, and religious order. We can condemn the violence, we can grieve for the countless women whose lives were sacrificed for this order. But to truly understand our own history, we must also recognize the logic that drove it. These were not monsters. They were architects of civilization, building a world of breathtaking complexity on a foundation of terrifying inequality. The stone remembers their certainty, and in its cold, polished surface, we see a reflection of the long, brutal journey from divine law to human rights, a journey that is far from over. You hold a Mesopotamian cylinder seal in your gloved hand. It's a small piece of carved lapis lazuli, cool and dense. Before writing on clay tablets became widespread, these seals were the primary instruments of administration and identity. Rolled across wet clay, the intricate negative carvings would leave a positive impression, a unique, repeating frieze of gods, heroes, and animals. Each seal was a personal signature, a mark of ownership, and a miniature narrative of its owner's place in the cosmos. You roll the seal across a bed of soft clay, and a scene emerges. A seated deity, a worshipper approaching with an offering, a series of celestial symbols. This tiny object is a key to the Mesopotamian mind. Look closer at the iconography. The scenes are not random. They are hierarchical, ordered, and precise. Gods are depicted larger than kings, kings larger than commoners. Every figure has its proper place, its designated role in the cosmic drama. This obsession with order, so evident in their legal codes, is carved into their earliest art. The world of the cylinder seal is a world without ambiguity. Everyone and everything is locked into a rigid social and divine hierarchy. In this context, an adulterous woman is more than just a lawbreaker. She's a chaotic element, a figure who has stepped out of her designated place in this perfectly ordered frieze. She has disrupted the scene. Her actions introduce an element of randomness, of personal desire, into a system designed to eliminate it. The brutal punishments prescribed by the law are an attempt to erase this chaotic signature, to smooth over the clay and re-roll the seal, restoring the perfect, predictable, and hierarchical order that was to them the very definition of civilization itself. The cylinder seal is not just an artifact, it is a worldview carved in miniature. You are looking at a famous Sumerian cylinder seal, the Adam and Eve seal, though that name is a modern invention. It depicts two figures, a man and a woman, seated on either side of a tree, with a serpent rising up behind the woman. For centuries this was seen as a precursor to the biblical story of Genesis, a Mesopotamian memory of the fall of man. But most modern scholars see something else entirely. They identify the figures not as the first humans, but as a god and a goddess, perhaps Inanna herself engaged in a sacred ritual. The tree is not the tree of knowledge, but a date palm, a symbol of fertility. The serpent is a symbol of healing and immortality. But regardless of the interpretation, the image resonates with a powerful archetypal theme: a woman, a tree, and a serpent, a triad that represents a moment of profound choice or transgression. This motif is not confined to the ancient Near East. You find echoes of it in the Greek myth of the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a serpent-like dragon. In Norse mythology, the world tree Yggdrasil is gnawed at by the serpent Nidhogga. From the serpent deities of Mesoamerican cultures to the Naga of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the serpent and the tree are potent recurring symbols, often linked to creation, knowledge, temptation, and the feminine divine. The fear of unregulated female sexuality, so brutally codified in Mesopotamian law, may be just one local expression of a much deeper, more universal human anxiety. It's an anxiety about the untamed forces of nature, about fertility and death, about the mysterious power of creation that women embody. The laws of Hammurabi may have been about property and inheritance on the surface, but beneath that they tap into a mythological bedrock, a worldwide story about the need to control the chaotic generative power that the serpent, the tree, and the woman have represented for millennia. You are standing on the shore of Lake Titicaca, high in the Andes. The air is painfully thin, the water a sheet of impossible cobalt blue under a vast sky. This is the highest navigable lake in the world, the cradle of Andean civilization. The cultures that rose here, the Tiwanaku, the Inca, were separated from Mesopotamia by 10,000 miles and an impassable ocean. They developed in complete isolation, and yet, when you examine the legal traditions that Spanish chroniclers recorded, you find a disturbing echo. In the Inca Empire, the punishment for adultery was also death. An adulterous couple could be stoned, hanged, or thrown from a cliff. The logic, too, was hauntingly familiar. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was considered a direct descendant of the sun god, Inti. The empire was a reflection of a divine cosmic order, and the family unit was its foundational block. A woman's fidelity was essential to maintaining the purity of the Ailu, the kinship group, and ensuring the orderly transfer of land and titles. An act of adultery was a crack in this foundation, an offence against the state and the gods. The chosen virgins of the sun, the Akala Kuna, were held to an even stricter standard. If one of them broke her vow of chastity, the law dictated she be buried alive, her lover strangled, and her entire home village razed to the ground. It is a chilling parallel to the punishment of Mesopotamian priestesses. Two civilizations with no contact, no shared history, independently arrive at the same brutal solution to the same social problem. It suggests that the logic of agricultural empires, the anxieties of patriarchal lineage, and the need for absolute social control are not culturally specific. They may be a recurring, almost mathematical product of civilization itself. The fear that drove Hammurabi to carve his laws into stone seems to be a ghost that haunts us across continents, a deep primal anxiety about order and lineage that found its most brutal expression on the bodies of women. You are in Rome, standing in the ruins of the Forum. The afternoon sun warms the ancient stones. Before you are the remains of the House of the Vestals, home to one of the most revered and feared religious orders in the Roman world. The Vestal virgins were priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their primary duty was to tend the sacred fire of Rome, a flame that could never be allowed to go out. Their purity was believed to be directly linked to the security and stability of the entire Roman state. They were chosen as young girls and served for 30 years, living lives of immense privilege and honour. But the price of that honour was absolute chastity. The parallel to the Mesopotamian temple priestesses and the Inca Akala Kuna is inescapable. In each case, a class of sacred women is set apart, their bodies transformed into symbols of the state's purity and divine favour, and in each case, the punishment for a sexual transgression is horrific. If a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, she was considered to have polluted the entire city, threatening Rome with divine retribution. The punishment was designed to cleanse this pollution without spilling her sacred blood. She was taken to a subterranean chamber, given a small amount of food and water, and sealed inside to die. Her lover was publicly flogged to death in the Forum. This recurring archetype, the sacred virgin whose purity guarantees the state's survival, reveals a deep-seated anxiety in patriarchal societies. It is the ultimate expression of the idea that female sexuality is a dangerous, chaotic force that must be either controlled within marriage for procreation or completely suppressed in the service of the divine. The Vestal, the priestess, the Akala, they are the symbolic counterweights to the adulterous wife. One is the guarantor of order, the other the agent of chaos. And the legal systems of these ancient empires built a terrifyingly symmetrical world around them, where the path to honor and the path to a brutal death were both paved with the control of the female body. You're examining a replica of a Babylonian boundary stone or kuduru. It is a heavy, polished stone carved with the details of a royal land grant, but your focus is not on the cuneiform text. It is on the divine symbols that encircle the top, a zodiac of Mesopotamian gods who act as witnesses and guarantors of the contract. There is the crescent moon of Sin, the solar disk of Shamash, the eight-pointed star of Ishtar. These are not mere decorations. They are a form of divine mathematics, a celestial equation that locks the earthly contract into the cosmic order. The Babylonians, who gave us algebra and the 360-degree circle, saw the universe as a place of profound mathematical harmony. Justice, to them, was not an abstract concept. It was a form of balance, an equation that must be solved. Consider the Assyrian law of adultery. The husband can kill his wife, pardon her, or mutilate her, and whatever he chooses for her he must inflict upon her lover. It is a terrifyingly perfect symmetry. Kill one, kill the other, mutilate one, mutilate the other. The principle of an eye for an eye, so famously articulated in Hammurabi's code, is applied here with a brutal mathematical precision. Adultery creates a social imbalance, a debt of honor. The punishment is the formula that restores equilibrium. It is not about forgiveness or rehabilitation. It is about solving the equation of the crime. This cold, impersonal calculus is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Mesopotamian legal mind. It reduced the complexities of human passion, betrayal, and despair to a problem of divine arithmetic. The woman, caught in this equation, was not a person with a story. She was a variable, a value to be cancelled out in order to rebalance the cosmic and social books. The justice they sought was not compassionate. It was merely correct. You're holding a small clay tablet covered in cuneiform. It is not a law code or a royal epic. It is a mathematical text, a series of exercises for a student scribe in ancient Babylon. The problems involve calculating the area of fields, the volume of canals, the interest on a loan. This is the mundane, practical application of the same mathematical genius that charted the heavens, and it reveals the final layer of the Mesopotamian worldview. For them, mathematics was not an abstract language. It was the language of reality itself. Everything from the movement of the planets to the price of barley could be understood through numbers. This numerical worldview extended to social order. The hierarchies of their society, gods, kings, noblemen, commoners, slaves, were not arbitrary. They were a reflection of a perceived mathematical harmony. Each person had a value, a specific weight in the grand equation of the state. The laws of adultery, with their careful gradations of punishment based on class, are a direct expression of this. The crime of a nobleman's wife had a higher social value, created a larger imbalance, and therefore required a more severe correction. The crime of a slave woman had a lower value and could be balanced with a simple payment. This is the ultimate logic of the system. It is a world without grace, a world where human lives are variables in a vast impersonal calculation. The law is not designed to be compassionate. It is designed to be correct. The husband who mutilates his wife is not just acting out of rage. He is a reluctant accountant, balancing the books of honor and property. It is a vision of society as a perfect, intricate machine, a celestial clockwork where every gear has its place. The tragedy is that, for this machine to run smoothly, some of its gears had to be ground to dust. The brutal punishments for adultery were the price they were willing to pay for a world that was, in their minds, mathematically and divinely perfect. You're in the mountains of northern Iraq in a valley carved by time. As dust settles, the air cools, carrying the scent of olive groves and wood smoke. You stand in the courtyard of the holy Yazidi shrine at Lalish. All around you, conical spires rise towards a sky turning purple and gold. This is a place of pilgrimage, a sanctuary for a people whose beliefs stretch back into the deepest layers of Mesopotamian history. The Yazidis are not Sumerians or Babylonians, but their cosmology is filled with echoes of that ancient world. They worship one god but believe he has entrusted the world to the care of 7 angels, the chief of whom is Tawuse Melek, the peacock angel. Here, in this living remnant of the ancient past, you can see how the logic of honor, purity, and social order continues to resonate. Yazidi society is traditionally organized into a strict caste system, and marriage outside of one's caste is forbidden. While the punishments are no longer those of Hammurabi's code, the underlying principle of maintaining social and spiritual purity remains. An act that transgresses these boundaries is not just a personal choice, it is a disruption of a sacred, time-honored order. Watching the pilgrims light sacred fires in the evening gloom, you feel the immense weight of that order. You see how a worldview, born on the plains of Sumer 4,000 years ago, can survive, adapt, and continue to shape human lives in the modern world. It is a sobering reminder that the past is never truly past. The anxieties about order, the definitions of honor, the rules that govern love and betrayal, these are not just artifacts in a museum. They are living ideas written not only in clay and stone, but in the hearts and minds of people who still walk the ancient lands. The ghosts of Mesopotamia are not gone. They are simply speaking a different language. You are listening to an oral history, a story passed down through countless generations of a Yazidi family. The elder speaks in a low, measured voice, his words painting a picture of a world before the Great Flood, a time when humanity lived for millennia and communed directly with the angels. These are not just fanciful tales. They are a form of memory, a cultural DNA that carries the echoes of the deepest Mesopotamian past. They speak of a time when the peacock angel, Tawuse Melek, descended to earth and brought beauty and colour to a world that was grey and barren. They tell of a covenant between God and humanity, a sacred promise to maintain the harmony of creation. Within these ancient stories lies a clue to the enduring power of these social codes. The rules governing marriage, purity, and social order are not seen as mere human conventions. They are believed to be part of this primordial covenant, a sacred duty passed down from the time before the flood. To break these rules is to break faith not just with your community, but with God and the 7 angels. It is to risk another cataclysm, another flood, another return to chaos. This is why the traditions hold such immense power. They are imbued with a cosmic significance, a weight of millennia. The laws of Hammurabi, carved in stone, were a political and social instrument, but the unwritten laws, preserved in oral traditions like these, are something deeper. They are a people's living connection to their sacred history, a way of keeping the world from falling apart. The brutal punishments of the past fade, but the core anxiety, the fear of chaos, the need for a pure and ordered community remains. Listening to the elder's voice as the mountain shadows lengthen, you understand that these are not just stories. They are the invisible architecture of a civilization, a framework for survival that has endured for 4,000 years. You are in a high-tech imaging lab, a place of humming machines and cool, recycled air. On a screen before you is a 3D model of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, rendered in stunning detail from satellite and ground-penetrating radar data. You can rotate the structure, peel back its layers, and examine its core geometry. What you see is a marvel of ancient engineering and mathematics. The ziggurat is not just a pile of bricks, it is a precisely calibrated cosmic mountain, a staircase to the heavens. Its orientation is aligned with the cardinal directions. Its dimensions are based on sacred numerological principles derived from the sexagesimal, or base 60 counting system of the Sumerians. This is the same system that gives us the 360-degree circle and the 60-minute hour. This mathematical precision was not reserved for sacred architecture. It was the organizing principle of their entire world. The calendar, the agricultural cycle, the administration of the state, the divisions of society and the laws that governed them, all were seen as components of a single, mathematically harmonious system. The brutal punishments for adultery were a part of this system. They were not an emotional outburst, but a calculated response, a necessary correction to maintain the integrity of the whole. In this worldview, a stable family with a clear line of patriarchal inheritance was the foundational geometric unit of the state. Adultery threatened this unit with a kind of mathematical chaos. It introduced an unknown variable into the equation of lineage. The law's response was to eliminate the variables: drowning, mutilation, death. These were not just punishments. They were the brutal act of solving for X, of restoring the equation to its pristine, predictable, and divinely sanctioned order. The genius that allowed them to chart the heavens and build these cosmic mountains was the same genius that produced a legal code of such terrifying, mathematical precision. It was a system designed to preserve the sacred, but it did so at an unimaginable human cost. You are standing before a limestone relief from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. The scene is one of brutal, propagandistic power. The king, a muscular, bearded figure, is shown hunting lions from his chariot. He is depicted as a demigod, a master of the natural world, a force of order against the chaos of the wild. This image is the key to the final layer of Mesopotamian law. The king was not merely a ruler, he was a bridge between the divine and the human. His bloodline was sacred, a direct channel of cosmic power. Preserving the purity of that bloodline was not a private family matter, it was an act of paramount state importance. The obsession with paternity, which drove the brutal adultery laws for commoners, was magnified 1,000-fold in the royal family. A queen's fidelity was a guarantee of the empire's stability. Any doubt about the legitimacy of the heir could trigger a succession crisis, a civil war that could shatter the kingdom. The concept of a woman as property finds its ultimate terrifying expression here. The queen was the most valuable possession of the state, the vessel that carried the future of the empire within her. Her sexuality was not her own. It was a state asset, guarded with the same ferocity as the palace treasury. This is why the laws carved by Hammurabi, himself a king and demigod in the eyes of his people, were so absolute. They were a projection of this royal anxiety onto the entire populace. Every household became a miniature kingdom, every husband a miniature king, every wife a vessel for a sacred lineage. The laws of adultery were not just about controlling women. They were about replicating the logic of divine kingship at every level of society. Every family was a dynasty in miniature, and every act of adultery was a potential succession crisis, a threat to an order that began and ended with the sacred blood of the king. You are in a university office late at night. The only light comes from your desk lamp illuminating a scattered collection of academic papers and translations. This is the quiet, patient work of history, cross-referencing, re-evaluating, looking for the nuances that previous generations of scholars might have missed. For over a century, the translation of Law 129 of Hammurabi's Code has seemed straightforward. An adulterous couple is bound and thrown into the water, but you're looking at a new analysis, a paper that re-examines the specific Akkadian verbs used in the text. The author, a young Assyriologist, argues that the phrasing implies not just a punishment, but a ritual. The act of binding them together, she suggests, is symbolic, a reenactment of the illicit union. Their fate to sink or swim is not merely a method of execution, but a direct appeal to the river god for a verdict. This subtle shift in translation opens up a new layer of meaning. It reframes the law from a simple act of state-sanctioned murder to a complex religious ritual. It suggests that the Mesopotamians were not just punishing a crime, they were attempting to ritually cleanse it, to expunge the stain of the chaotic act from the community. This interpretation doesn't lessen the brutality, but it deepens our understanding of the mindset behind it. It reveals a world where the boundaries between law, religion, and magic were fluid, where a legal sentence could also be a prayer and an execution could be a form of divine communion. The history of these ancient laws is not static. It is a living field of inquiry, constantly being refined by new discoveries and new interpretations. Every retranslation, every re-examination of a familiar text has the potential to alter our understanding of the past, to reveal the hidden logics and forgotten beliefs that shaped these ancient worlds. The voices of the past are not fixed. They change as we learn to listen more closely. You're standing at the top of the Palatine Hill in Rome, looking down at the sprawling ruins of the Forum. The sound of the modern city is a dull roar in the distance. Here, among the broken columns and weathered stones, you can feel the echoes of a different legal tradition. In the early Roman Republic, the law of the 12 Tables governed society. Like the Code of Hammurabi, it was harsh and unequivocal. But there is a subtle and profound difference. The Roman concept of pater familias, the absolute power of the father over his household, gave a husband the legal right to kill his adulterous wife on the spot. This was not a state execution, nor was it a divine ordeal. It was a private right, a matter of domestic authority. This privatization of justice reveals a different relationship between the individual and the state. In Mesopotamia, adultery was a crime against a cosmic and social order, enforced by the king. In Rome, it was primarily a crime against the honor and authority of the head of the household. The state had outsourced its enforcement. But the outcome was the same, a brutal double standard where a man's infidelity was often overlooked, while a woman's was a capital offense. As the Roman Republic gave way to the empire, this power began to shift. The Emperor Augustus, in an attempt to legislate morality and restore what he saw as declining family values, enacted the Julian laws. These laws made adultery a public crime for the first time. The husband was now legally obligated to divorce his wife and prosecute both her and her lover. If he failed to do so, he could be prosecuted himself for profiting from her infidelity. The punishment was no longer death, but exile and the confiscation of property. The power of life and death was taken from the husband and reclaimed by the state. It was a step away from private vengeance, but a step towards a new kind of social control, where the emperor, not the gods or the family patriarch, was the ultimate arbiter of sexual morality. You're standing on a desolate plain in what is now southern Iraq. The sun is relentless, the landscape a shimmering expanse of baked earth and heat haze. You're looking at a series of strange, shallow depressions in the ground, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But geological surveys and satellite imaging reveal a shocking truth. These are the spectral footprints of ancient riverbeds, channels carved by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers thousands of years ago. In places they no longer flow. This entire landscape has been violently reshaped. The archaeological evidence for a great flood, a cataclysm that wiped out the earlier Sumerian settlements, is undeniable. At the ancient city of Ur, archaeologists found a sterile layer of river silt nearly 3 meters thick, separating the earliest layers of human habitation from those that came after. This was not a myth, it was a cataclysm. A civilization was wiped from the face of the earth. The Sumerian king list speaks of a time before the flood, a lost world of demigod kings with impossibly long lifespans. What if the brutal, obsessive legal codes of Mesopotamia were not an invention, but a desperate reinvention? What if they were the traumatized response of a civilization that had seen its world utterly destroyed by the chaotic forces of nature? Perhaps the obsession with order, the need to control every aspect of human life from inheritance to sexuality, was a desperate attempt to build a society that could never again be washed away. Perhaps the brutal punishments were not just about controlling women, but about controlling chaos itself, a force they had witnessed at a terrifying world-ending scale. We have their laws, but the cataclysm may have erased the why. We are left with a brutal answer, but the original question, the original trauma, is buried under 3 meters of sterile clay. You are looking at grainy black and white photographs from the 1940s. They show a remote island in Melanesia, its inhabitants meticulously building life-sized replicas of airplanes out of straw and wood. They carve wooden headphones and sit in makeshift control towers, staring at the sky. These are the famous cargo cults, religious movements that sprang up after World War II. During the war, these islanders had seen American military cargo planes descend from the sky, bringing unimaginable wealth, canned food, steel tools, medicine. When the war ended and the planes stopped coming, they developed a complex ritual magic to bring them back. They mimicked the actions of the ground crews, waved landing signals and prayed for the return of the cargo. They were survivors of a cataclysm, a brief and bewildering encounter with a godlike technological power. They did not understand the underlying mechanics of air travel or global logistics. All they knew was that certain rituals had once brought wealth from the heavens, and so they copied the forms, hoping to recapture the substance. Now think again of the Sumerians, the survivors of the Great Flood. Imagine their world before the cataclysm, a civilization ruled by demigod kings, perhaps possessing knowledge and abilities we can no longer fathom. The flood washes it all away. The survivors, like the islanders, are left with only fragments, with half-remembered stories of a golden age. Is it possible that the civilizations that came after, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, were, in a sense, cargo cults of their own lost history? Were their rigid laws, their obsessive rituals, their brutal punishments, a desperate attempt to mimic the forms of a lost higher civilization, hoping to bring back the stability and prosperity of the world before the flood. Perhaps Hammurabi's code was not a brilliant invention, but a flawed copy, a cargo cult law written by survivors who remembered the fruits of a lost order, but had forgotten the knowledge that made it possible. You are in the desert outside Nag Hammadi, Egypt. The heat is a physical presence, shimmering above the sand. It was here in 1945 that a local farmer unearthed a sealed jar containing a collection of ancient papyrus codices. These were the Gnostic Gospels, a radical, mystical form of early Christianity that was declared heretical and ruthlessly suppressed. You hold a translation of one of these texts, the Apocryphon of John. It tells a story of creation that is a shocking inversion of the one we know. In this version, the God of the Old Testament is not the true ultimate God, but a lesser flawed being called the Demiurge. He is arrogant, jealous, and ignorant, a blind creator who traps human souls in a flawed material world. The Gnostics saw the legal codes of the old world, with their harsh judgments and brutal punishments, as the work of this Demiurge. They were the laws of a cosmic tyrant, designed to keep humanity enslaved to the material world of property, lineage, and fear. True salvation, for the Gnostics, lay in rejecting these laws and seeking direct personal knowledge, or gnosis, of the true transcendent God beyond this flawed creation. They practiced a radical form of spiritual egalitarianism, often allowing women to serve as priests and teachers. Their view of sexuality was complex and varied, but many Gnostic sects rejected procreation, seeing it as a trick of the Demiurge to trap more divine souls in material bodies. This was not just a theological disagreement, it was a revolution. It was a complete rejection of the entire social, legal, and cosmological order that had dominated the ancient world for 3,000 years. It was a declaration that the laws of Hammurabi, the honor codes of the patriarchs, the very concept of a society built on inherited property and controlled bloodlines were not a divine order, but a prison. The brutal suppression of the Gnostics was not just about stamping out a heresy. It was about defending the foundations of a civilization whose brutal laws of adultery were a direct expression of the very worldview the Gnostics sought to shatter. You are standing in a modern art gallery. The walls are white, the lighting is stark. Before you is a minimalist sculpture, a single perfect steel cube. It is an object of pure form, stripped of all myth, all history, all divine significance. It is a monument to a world that has in many ways embraced the Gnostic rebellion. We live in a disenchanted world, a world we believe is governed not by gods or cosmic principles, but by the impersonal laws of physics. We have, for the most part, rejected the idea of divine kingship, of a sacred social order, of laws handed down from heaven, and in doing so, we have begun the slow, painful work of dismantling the legal and social structures that were built upon that ancient foundation. The journey from Hammurabi's code to modern human rights is a journey from a world where order was paramount to a world where individual freedom is, at least in theory, the highest value. The brutal punishments for adultery were not just cruel, they were the logical endpoint of a worldview that saw women as property, marriage as a tool for inheritance, and society as a fragile machine that could be broken by a single act of personal desire. To move beyond them required a complete reimagining of our place in the universe. It required us to reject the Demiurge, to declare that the laws that govern us are not divine, but human, and therefore can be changed. This journey is far from complete. The ghosts of that ancient order still haunt us, in the honor killings that still occur, in the legal systems that still fail to protect women, in the cultural anxieties that still surround female sexuality. But the change is undeniable. We no longer throw women in the river to solve a problem of paternity. We have begun the long, arduous process of freeing ourselves from a command that is 4,000 years old. The white cube in the gallery is not just a work of art. It is a symbol of a world struggling to be born, a world free from the shadow of the lawgiver's stone. You have returned to the banks of the Euphrates. It is dawn. A thin mist hangs over the water and the air is cool and still. The journey is over, but the questions remain, hanging in the quiet morning air like the mist. You have walked through the ruins of empires, deciphered the laws of god-kings, and traced the echoes of these ancient anxieties across continents and millennia. You have seen how the fear of chaos, the need for order, and the brutal logic of patriarchal inheritance converged to create a legal system that terrorized women for thousands of years. You have understood the why, the complex web of property, honor, and cosmology that made these laws seem not just necessary but righteous. But understanding is not absolution. As the first rays of sunlight strike the water, turning it from grey to gold, you think of the countless nameless women who met their end in this river. The women who made impossible choices in a world that gave them none. The women who were sacrificed on the altar of social stability. The human cost of this ancient order is incalculable, a debt that can never be repaid. The laws of Hammurabi are not just a historical curiosity. They're a monument to a worldview that saw women not as people, but as property, as variables in a celestial equation, as potential agents of chaos to be controlled and, if necessary, eliminated. We have travelled far from this riverbank. We have built new worlds on new principles. But the shadow of that black diorite stele is long. The questions it raises, about justice, about power, about the price of order, are not confined to the ancient past. They are with us still, and as the sun rises over the plains of ancient Sumer, they echo in the morning silence. You're standing in the main archive of the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative at UCLA. All around you are climate-controlled shelves holding hundreds of thousands of meticulously catalogued clay tablets. But you're looking at a high-resolution monitor, scrolling through a vast interconnected database. This is where the ancient world is being reborn. Scholars from around the globe are using artificial intelligence and advanced imaging techniques to translate and cross-reference the entire corpus of cuneiform literature. What once would have taken a lifetime of painstaking work can now be done in a matter of weeks. Patterns that were invisible to the human eye are now emerging from the data. An AI, trained on tens of thousands of legal and economic texts, flags a recurring anomaly. In a small but significant number of inheritance documents from the Old Babylonian period, the line of succession deviates from the strict patriarchal norm. Property is passed not from father to son, but through the maternal line. These are not just isolated cases. They form a distinct cluster, both geographically and chronologically. What could this mean? Does it point to a subculture with different marital laws, a remnant of an older, perhaps more egalitarian tradition? Could it be a legal workaround for cases where the husband was infertile or absent? This is where the future of history lies, not in a single dramatic discovery, but in the slow, patient revelation of patterns hidden in the noise of millennia. Every tablet that is scanned, every line of cuneiform that is translated and added to this global database brings the picture into slightly sharper focus. The grand, monolithic narrative of Mesopotamian law, so brutally clear on the stele of Hammurabi, is beginning to fracture, revealing a world far more complex, more varied, and more human than we ever imagined. The whispers of the women in the divorce petitions are being joined by a chorus of new voices, voices that speak not of brutality, but of resilience, adaptation, and the quiet, persistent subversion of an ironclad law. You're back in the Louvre, but the crowds are gone. It is after midnight. The only sound is the echo of your own footsteps on the marble floors. You stand once more before the Code of Hammurabi. In the silence, under the low gallery lights, the black stone seems to hold a different kind of presence. It is no longer just a historical artifact, a testament to a brutal and distant past. It feels like a seed, a single, perfectly formed seed of an idea. The idea that society requires a written code, an external objective authority to which all are subject. An idea that would grow and branch and evolve over the next 4,000 years, transforming into the vast, complex and deeply flawed legal systems that govern our world today. The laws carved into this stone were designed to create a world of absolute certainty, certainty of paternity, certainty of inheritance, certainty of social order, certainty of divine favour. The brutal punishments for adultery were the price of that certainty. They were the violence that underwrote the entire system. We have, in our modern world, traded much of that certainty for a measure of freedom. We have accepted the ambiguities of a world where paternity can be questioned, where bloodlines are not destiny, where women are not property. But that trade was not made easily, and it is not yet complete. The shadow of this stone, of the worldview it represents, is long. It reaches from the banks of the Euphrates into our own time, into our own lives, into our own ongoing struggle to define what is just, what is sacred, and what price we are willing to pay for order. The questions Hammurabi tried to answer in stone are questions we're still answering today. And the silence of the women who paid the price for his certainty is a silence that we're only now beginning to understand. You stand at the edge of the known world, looking out over a vast dark ocean. Behind you is the flickering firelight of human settlement, the world of laws, hierarchies, and certainties. Before you is the unknown. This is the final haunting question that emerges from the study of these ancient laws. If the civilizations we know, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Inca, were built on this brutal logic of patriarchal control, what lies in the darkness beyond them? What other ways of being have we lost to the cataclysms of history, to the floods and the fires and the slow, grinding passage of time? The Indus Valley, with its undeciphered script and its enigmatic, peaceful art, is a ghost of one such possibility. The Gnostic Gospels are the textual remnant of another. How many other worlds have been lost? How many other legal systems, other cosmologies, other ways of understanding love, family, and society have vanished without a trace? The history we have is the history that survived, the history that was carved in stone and backed by the sword. It is a history written by the victors, by the builders of empires, by the societies that prized order above all else. But it may not be the only history. Perhaps the most profound mystery is not what these ancient laws tell us, but what they don't. They speak of a worldview obsessed with control, but perhaps that obsession was born from the memory of a world that was free. Perhaps the brutality was not an invention, but a reaction, a desperate and violent attempt to wall off a forgotten, wilder, and more chaotic human past. We are the inheritors of the world that Hammurabi built. We live inside the architecture of his logic, but somewhere, out in the darkness, beyond the edge of the firelight, lie the ruins of other worlds, and the echo of a freedom we have long since forgotten how to name.